Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and in this video, we're going to be talking about schools of thought in economics. Schools of economic thought. Okay, so we previously we discussed the transition from feudalism to capitalism, like that old system that had existed for a long time in Europe, to this new system that is just emerging, and how economic theory arises out of that transition to try to come to grips with and explain the new system. Okay, so right, that's our historical context, transition from feudalism to capitalism. And all of the struggles and tensions and contradictions, the difficulties of that, and also there's a lot of new opportunities and positive developments as well. So, but it's a big change. That's the point, right? And it leads to uncertainty, confusion, difficulty understanding this new thing. Right, the prevalence of markets is much greater than it had been previously. Okay, really at any other point in history. All right. And there's a bunch of other new things happening as well. Okay, so one theorist in particular really stands out as a very, very influential thinker, so much so that we could call this person really the founder of modern economics. If anyone deserves that title, it is Adam Smith. Right, Adam Smith was writing in 1776, kind of an auspicious year, Declaration of Independence, and so forth. And he wrote a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. We often just shorten it to The Wealth of Nations. And Smith is very interested in the question of what determines economic growth, why some societies become wealthy and others do not, right? And in particular, he wanted to displace the existing idea, right? He said, like, all right, so if our question here is, why does a country become rich, right? And other countries don't, all right? So, the prevailing idea at the time was, well, it had to do with the fertility of the soil. All right. The fertility of the soil and the amount of land that they had and whatever. Remember, in the past, in the feudal era that at this time, right, at 1776, Europe is just emerging from the feudal era, right? Capitalism is very young. And the feudal era is based on agriculture, right? Based on farming. So it would make sense to say, okay, at that time, the more you can produce out of the soil, the richer you're going to be, right? But Smith said no, right? That might have been true in the past, but something new is happening, okay? Something new is happening. The growth of markets and the growth of this new thing is leading to changes which mean the rich countries now and perhaps in the future, this is not the key determining factor, okay? So to explain what is, right, of course where Smith ends up with is that markets are the key, right? So markets, and very necessary to go along with it, private property, okay? So Smith focuses a lot on these are the keys to wealth, okay? And how does this work? Okay, so markets and private property, his argument is that this leads to a greater productivity of labor, right? And the productivity of labor, Smith's argument is that is really the key to the wealth of nations, okay? If there are forces which raise the productivity of labor, that society is going to become wealthy. All right. In fact, and later economic theories working in the tradition of Adam Smith argue that not only is the country going to become wealthy, it is going to maximize the wealth of the nation. All right, now Smith did not use modern economic terminology that had not yet been developed in his time. So what we mean by the wealth of nations now, okay, the modern term that we would use is GDP, which stands for gross domestic product. Now, I'm going to discuss that at length, later in the course. Okay, so, but for now, just think of it conceptually. Okay, what is the total amount of wealth that the society is generating per year? Okay, so it's also called economic income. Income is a flow of wealth that occurs, per unit of time. Okay, so the amount of wealth per year. All right, Smith is saying what leads to that? What leads to that being higher, and what leads to the optimal amount that a society can produce? Okay, so he used an argument which later became very famous, right? Because Smith became a kind of instant classic, right? And this was like some books are like this. They're written at the right time and the right place, and they have the level of detail and the logic that is perhaps better than other arguments that had come before. Or because Smith is actually not the first person to even make this argument, but he makes it in a better way, a more comprehensive way. It for whatever reason, it becomes the classic, the thing that you must read if you want to understand something about this new system that's emerging. All right, and so Smith, it becomes known as the tradition of classical political economy. Okay, so here's the substance of his argument, which is, how do we know that markets and private property lead to the increase in the productivity of labor? Okay, so Smith examines a thing that's happening, okay, that is the birth of industrialization. It begins very small, okay? It begins with a shift from the old system, okay? So now we talked about, in the previous lecture, we talked about feudalism, mostly in terms of agriculture, okay? So now we want to discuss it in terms of manufacturing, okay? So feudalism in Europe, for the 1,000+ years that it exists, is not really focused on manufacturing. It's mostly agriculture, but they do have a system of manufacturing, okay? That is the guild system, okay? The guild system is designed for several purposes, okay? The way this system works is, if you're in any kind of manufacturing, anything from being a carpenter to a mason to a blacksmith to a clockmaker. I mean, it's very, very specialized, right? Each kind of production has its own guild, okay? And the way that this works is you have a master and you have an apprentice, okay? So, and there's different levels, journeymen and so forth, right? Different levels within this. But the point is that the guild system, through this having a master and apprentice, and the way this works, right? The apprentice, the master teaches the apprentice, right? The apprentice learns, and in return provides free or low-cost labor, right? Maybe they just get room and board, or maybe they get paid, but it's a small amount, So this is because, like teaching somebody something is work, and if you're teaching somebody blacksmithing, then you're going to get less done yourself, right? It's gonna hurt your productivity. So in exchange, the apprentice, helps out and does the low-level tasks, or works the bellows or whatever, right? Does the low-level tasks that the master doesn't want to do or can pass off to the apprentice, okay? So, and traditionally, this arrangement would last 7 years, at which point the apprentice has now been fully trained, right? So, in terms of an economic system, the guild system did several things, right? It made sure that you had a high level of skill and quality when it came to these different kinds of production, right? So, high level of skill because you had a system of training, right? You had a system of training in place so that you could say, look, if somebody was a member of the guild, then we're sure that they've been, they do good work, right? So training, quality, right? And also, what it did was very important. It limited access to that kind of production. Okay, so this is how we make sure that there's not going to be too many carpenters, all right? Because the way that this part of, this is under the feudal system, okay? So the guild system, recall, this is part of feudalism, right? So these people are artisans, they're craftsmen, right? They're not serfs. They don't have that kind of relationship with a lord where they don't do the corvée, right? That's only in agriculture. These people sell their goods and services on the open market, okay? They are, small time artisans. People like this still exist today, of course, okay? It's just that in the feudal era, this is all there was in manufacturing, right? There weren't factories yet. Okay, so that's the old system. You limit access to production, and then you ensure that the pay is relatively high. Okay, so the quality of the goods and services is high. And the pay for those is also high because there's not too much supply. Okay, so by limiting access to production, we limit the number of people who are trained in this field, right? Because what do you think would happen if there was all of a sudden a huge number of carpenters in a given town, right? Probably what would happen is that their pay would fall, right? They would compete with one another, and they need to work, right? That's the only way they have an income. So they would bid down the price of their service, and that would be bad for them all, right? So the guild it's kind of like the opposite of a competitive market, right? They are limiting access, right? They're limiting entry, and what you produce out of this high skill, training process and whatever, is you have workers who know how to do each step uh, of the productive of production. Okay, so however many steps there are in making a horseshoe or building a house or whatever it is, right? So Smith, in looking at this, right, he takes a look at one particular industry, one particular kind of manufacturing. Okay, so the making of pins. Okay, the pin making industry. Okay, so the pin making industry is, this is a guild. It's run by a guild, just like everything else, right? And the people who make pins, there's steps of the process. They buy wire, they have to straighten the wire, they have to sharpen the tip, they have to make the head of the pin, they have to connect them. Okay, and by the way, the pin making industry is becoming more and more important because the way that industrialization takes place. Okay, so Smith is writing and observing England. Okay, and England is really the birthplace of capitalism and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which Smith is describing. Okay, so and this begins in the textile industry. Okay, so you can see that making pins is related to textiles, right? If you're going to be making clothing, then you need pins, right? That holds it together so that you can make the clothing. Okay, so the old system, right? Highly skilled workers who knew each step of the production process. They did each step of the production process. Okay, and Smith says, let's take a look at the productivity of their labor under the old system. Okay, so the way that production is organized, you have, these pin makers and whatever, they're working alone, probably, right? Or perhaps they have an apprentice or two. It's a small workshop, right? And they do each step of the production process, etc. Okay, so their productivity is they can produce, according to Smith, perhaps 10 to 20 pins per day. Okay, so the day is the relevant unit of time. Back at the time that Smith was writing, right, in 1700s and 1800s, workers were paid by the day. Everything was by the day, right? Not yet by the hour. Okay, so that's the old system. All right. Now, what Smith notices, he says, a new system is emerging. That new system doesn't even really have a name, right? Later, it gets called capitalism. Okay, so I've just kind of described this in this column, right? Smith calls this new system, he calls it simply the factory system. Okay, like I said, at the time that Smith is writing, the word capitalism has not yet been invented. Uh, that comes later. Okay, so the factory system and Smith is very different, right? What is different about the factory system is what has been done is all of these steps of making pins. Perhaps there's 10 steps. Okay, so the labor process is divided into those 10 steps. Okay, into steps. All right, and Smith calls this the division of labor. Okay, so divided into steps, and then a worker is going to do each step, right? So one worker per step. All right, and this is called specialization. Okay, so key to Smith's argument, division of labor and specialization. All right, now this has a bunch of different effects. Okay, one effect is, you have somebody who is just taking the wire and measuring it, right? And then somebody else whose job it is to cut it, right? Or somebody else whose job it is to sharpen it. Okay, that's all you do all day long, right? You just cut the wire, cut the wire, cut the wire, right? That's it. Okay, so that's specialization, as division of labor, right? Now, here's the thing: if you hire people to cut wire or sharpen wire, they don't really need 7-year apprenticeships, right? This is unskilled labor, okay? Unskilled labor, it's not highly trained, it's not highly skilled, okay? Uh, Unskilled labor, and, this means that unskilled labor, when it comes to wages, is going to receive much lower wages than these highly skilled, highly trained workers over here, all right? Okay, so that's an advantage, right, for the owner. Now, by the way, who is going to work these jobs, right? Everyone in the society under feudalism already kind of has their place, right? Like the serfs, they work the land, and they have their place, right? The artisans, they did, like I said, right? It's a highly hierarchical, very stable kind of society. The son does what the father did, etc. Right? That's kind of the basis of the society. So where do we get these all of a sudden workers that are willing to work for wages, right? Well, this comes out of the disruption of the feudal system, like I said, right? Like the rise of trade, serfs begin to flee from their feudal manners and so forth, right? So we start to have a pool of workers who is willing to work for wages, right? They have no alternative. They've been cut off from the land and so forth, okay? Smith doesn't really mention that. It's not really his focus, but, we know this from other, historical documents and so forth, okay? So unskilled worker working for low wages, all right? So this is already a benefit, right, for the owner of this, okay? And then we also have a separation between the owner, right, the under the old system, the people are working for themselves, right? Or maybe they have an apprentice who will one day work for himself as well, right? So that's the old system, right? The new system has an owner who's different from the workers, all right? So now, but where Smith says, look, where this really shines and where the difference becomes really, really important is that the productivity here is far, far greater, okay? So let's say that there's 10 workers, okay, which is necessary because, again, we've divided it into steps, and, let's say there's 10 steps, and each worker does a step and so forth, right? That's different too, because now you have a different organization of production, right? It is a collective or social type of production rather than much more individual as in the old system, okay? So you have 10 workers, and here's the thing, okay? In a day, these 10 workers are capable of producing a staggering 48,000 pins per day. Wow, that's unbelievable, right? So, if we divide that by 10 to get it on a per worker, per day system, right? So divide that by 10, you have one worker producing on average 4,800 pins per day. versus the old system, right? Like, let's compare that, right? The old system, 10 or 20 pins a day. That's not even close, right? I mean, wow, what a huge, huge difference in output, a huge difference in productivity, right? Um, Now, what might be the consequences of this, right? How do you think this is going to affect the pin market? How do you think the price of pins is likely to be affected? Okay, so P subscript pins, right? The price of pins. How do you think that's likely to be affected? Well, if you said it's going to go down, you're absolutely correct. Congratulations, you win a prize. The price of pins is going to go down. Okay, so now Smith is taking a very big picture view of this and saying this is a good thing, right? This is fantastic because we're producing a lot more pins, right? And that's the key to this argument, right? We're producing more wealth per day, right? Rather than this old-fashioned, system that only produces 10 or 20, we're producing nearly 5,000. That's an absolutely stunning increase in the productivity of labor. Okay, so let's describe the consequences of this, right? As the price of pins declines, right? So there's parts of this that are very positive, right? So Smith emphasizes the positive, aspects of this, right? Like I said, the productivity of labor has gone up, the amount of wealth produced, in general by the society has gone up, right? Now, others emphasize more the negative aspects of this, right? So, how do you think, for example, this affects the workers who were producing pins before that, right, under the old system? So, if the price of pins goes down, that affects everybody, right? Like the pin worker who was, the pin craftsman or artisan or whatever you want to call them, right? The one who's making 10 or 20 pins a day. Okay, so let's say they're making 10. Okay, they're sort of on the 10, really nice, really high quality, handmade, pins. Okay, gorgeous pins. Okay, but here's the problem, right? The price falls for everybody. Okay, so if the price of pins, let's say, declines by 50%, not at all unreasonable, right? Given the change in productivity here, enormous change in productivity, the price of pins gets cut in half, right? Do you see what happens to this artisan, right? What happens to their income? Their income is entirely based on how many pins they produce, right? So when the price of pins falls, their income gets cut in half. I spelled cut wrong. All right. It gets cut in half, right? Now, they might say, wow, I don't know what's going on here, right? The guild relies on that you can keep out competition, that you can keep out people that aren't in the guild, right? So these factory workers are not in the guild. The guilds naturally try to keep them out, okay? But they lose, right? So guilds try to prevent these new factories from existing. They burn down their factories and workshops and whatever, right? There's conflict over this because that's the whole basis of the guild system, right? But they lose. The increase in productivity is so much greater, right? And you don't have to be nearby either for it to have an effect, right? This is the thing about markets, right? That factory that's producing pins could be far away from you and still drag down the prices, right? Okay, so it depends on the extent and the development of markets, all right? And that was the next piece of Smith's argument. The greater the scale of markets, the greater the distance over which things are traded, the greater can be the division of labor and specialization, the greater can be the amount of wealth, okay? So again, some of this creates positive effects, but some of it creates very negative effects, right? These pin workers, okay, the guilds lose, and the pin makers under the old system now become, unemployed, right? So it's not like that no one fired them, right? They can still continue to produce pins. It's just that now they're getting half, or perhaps prices fall even more, right? Maybe prices fall 80%, right? Now they're getting only 20% of what they once got. At some point, it becomes just non-viable, right? That is, you cannot make a living producing pins by hand in an environment where the price of pins is very low. Okay, so they have to give up their workshops. They have to seek other employment, right? And this is what really destroys the guild system. Okay, and so we end up with a pool of unemployed workers, right? Workers who are seeking jobs because their old job has been destroyed. Okay, now I know what you're thinking, right? Oh, the pin makers. Well, okay, so what, right? That's just one job. I mean, there's must have been lots of jobs created, right? Well, here's the thing, right? Industrialization disrupted not just pin making, but many, many traditional occupations. Okay, so many traditional occupations were disrupted by falling prices. Okay, so they become economically non-viable. You just cannot make enough money at producing at them. Okay, so remember, the Industrial Revolution begins with textiles. Okay, so now textiles in Britain at the time were based on wool. Okay, and there's a whole set of different handicrafts, rural industries, rural manufacturing that supports wool textiles. Okay, again, before the Industrial Revolution, one of the first machines that we think of, when we think of the Industrial Revolution, is the spinning jenny, right? It's the machine which takes wool fibers and spins them into yarn or thread. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different steps in going from wool, right, that comes from sheep, to clothing, right? Clothing, there's many, many steps in making clothing, right? So there's like I said, an entire rural industry. The reason I say rural is because most of this, right, it starts with raising sheep, and then it kind of goes from there, right? So these are the kinds of things I'm talking about, right? Raising sheep, right? And then, the sheep get shorn, right? They get you cut their fleece off, okay? And then you got to spin the wool into yarn. Okay, now spinning wool into yarn is a very, very common rural occupation. Many, many people at the time either did that wholly, that was all they did, or they did it as a way of supplementing their income. Perhaps they raised sheep during the day, they do some spinning at night, right? That's very, very common. Okay, maybe they use the yarn for their own purposes, maybe they sell it in the market, right? It's a mix of things. Okay, so others will then take the spun yarn and then weave it into cloth, right? Now, obviously, the finer you do this, right, you can make a rough yarn, a real thick piece of yarn. It's like as thick as this pen, right? That's easier to make than a very thin wool thread, right? The thin wool thread takes a lot more detail. It takes a lot more careful spinning, okay? So, there's not just one kind of cloth here. There's not just one kind of wool. There's many kinds, right? But what I'm talking about is the steps here, right? So spinning, weaving, and then, sewing, etc., right? All of these many, many different rural occupations, traditional occupations get disrupted, right? Why do they get disrupted? Well, because the same thing that happens in pin making happens in all of these things, right? Like the spinning jenny, the industrialization of spinning, means that the price of yarn falls. Okay, the price of yarn, the price of thread, the price of fabric, which affects the weavers, right? All of these things fall. And again, we could emphasize the positive of this, like Smith did, right? Okay, that's great. That's highly productive. That's more wealth. It's progress. Fantastic, right? But it also throws many, many thousands and thousands of people get thrown out of work, okay? And then they enter this they don't know what to do, right? And what they do is they leave the countryside, many of them, right, and enter the cities. Okay, so they go to the cities, right? And this this all happens, in different ways, but at the same time, right? And the cities, because of the development of factories, trade, all of the things that I mentioned, relative to the transition to capitalism, the cities, grow enormously, and they have tremendous problems and difficulties as a result of that. Okay, so but again, Smith emphasizes really the positive aspects of this, right? And then we have another thinker who comes along a little bit later. Okay, his name is David Ricardo. All right, and Ricardo wrote in the early 1800s. Okay, so just a few decades later. All right, and Ricardo's book was called Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. All right, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And because Ricardo, read Smith very carefully, again, Smith was already considered a classic by that time, and Ricardo emphasized and developed Smith's points. Okay, so Smith and Ricardo, again, these two become the kind of core writers in this tradition of classical political economy. All right, and the theme is, look, this new system that's developing is very positive, right? So I just have to mention, right, Smith and Ricardo are not at all focusing on the negatives, and perhaps that's because Smith and Ricardo themselves never lost their jobs. They never were like negatively affected by it, right? If you had asked, these spinners or weavers or pin makers or anyone who was disrupted for reasons they can barely understand, right, and lost their traditional way of making a living and had to completely upend their life and either live with on a lot less, right, or move out of the countryside and into the city to try and make it, and a lot of difficulties associated with that. All right, so again, Smith and Ricardo, okay, they focus on the positive aspects of the new system. Okay, we'll just use the word capitalism, even though they did not use that word, right? They focus on the positive aspects of capitalism, and perhaps this is at least in part because of their relatively privileged position in the economic order. Okay, so Smith was a professor. Okay, he's not someone who lost his job as a result of this, and Ricardo was a London banker. Okay, someone who, as a young man, was a financial speculator. He did a deal and made a huge amount of money. Right before that, he had, though he was from a middle class family, his family, cast him out because he married outside the religion. Anyway, the point is, he was a very prominent member of society. Okay, a banker, and then later a member of the parliament. Okay, a very prominent person, right? So again, focusing much more, and being a banker, was much more plugged into the new system, right? His financial interests were much more connected to the new system that was emerging rather than the old system, right? He doesn't come from the aristocracy. Neither one of these came from the aristocracy. They were not upset about the threats that this new stuff represented to feudalism, okay? So very much focusing here on the positive aspects of capitalism, the increase in productivity. Smith goes even further with this, right, and says basically what happens here is if the markets are competitive, okay, this becomes the argument, right? Competitive markets lead to a very positive, stable situation in society, okay? They lead us to, again, the maximum output or wealth in the society, right? Each person operating in self-interest produces a situation which is good for all, okay? So increase in productivity is a key part of the story, right? Smith said this works by, he created a very famous metaphor here, the metaphor of the invisible hand, right? The market is guided to this optimal result as if by an invisible hand, okay? So now, if this works so well, right, we can put our faith in competitive markets. And then the way this was interpreted later was to say, look, we don't need the government making rules which limit trade and markets. Okay? We don't want that. We don't need that. Now, again, at the time, okay, so I'm going to write free trade, right? This is the argument for free trade, very much made by Smith and Ricardo. So at the time, there were all kinds of limits and boundaries on trade, right? So governments, it's kings really, okay? Because in 1776, Europe is still governed by kings. All right. So in 1776, Europe is still governed by kings, right? This is very, very early in the process of, revolution and so forth that begins to occur later. Okay, so in Europe at the time, of course, everything is still ruled by kings, right? That begins to change, at around this time, but kings are still very, very strong. It's still the time of kings. Okay, so governments like to do things at the time. They like to do things which limit trade. Okay, so here's the kinds of things that they do, which are the opposite of competitive markets. Okay, so they use trade barriers. Okay, so things like tariffs, quotas, or even sanctions. All right, so tariffs is a tax on trade. Quota is a hard limit on trade. Sanction is a limit of 0 on trade. Okay, so these are different kinds of trade barriers, and kings, governments, etc., love to use these kinds of barriers as political tools, right? That is, as tools to gain and control, right? To gain power and maintain power. That is, look, if we like what you're doing, right? Let's say England says this to France. France, we like what you're doing. Great, keep it up. You know what you get as a reward? You get low tariffs. Okay, we're going to give you special low tariffs that we're not giving anybody else. Oh, now wait a minute. We don't like what you're doing now. Guess what? High tariffs. High tariffs. So this becomes a tool of political control, right? Smith and Ricardo are arguing, don't do that, right? By doing that, you're making yourself poorer, okay? You are limiting the extent of the market, okay? Governments and kings also like to do other kinds of anti-competitive things, right? They grant, for example, a royal charter to one company. The Dutch East India Company is a famous example, right? This is the company that has a charter to trade with India. Okay, so a royal charter creates a monopoly, right? Again, a monopoly is the opposite of a competitive market. There's one seller. Okay, so Smith is not arguing that a monopoly is going to work for society, right? It's competitive markets. Markets must be competitive. Okay, so we create here an argument for free trade that says governments and kings should do as little of this as possible. Okay, so no barriers to trade, right? No preferential treatment of certain institutions, no creating monopolies, okay, and no price controls, okay, no trying to limit the price, no trying to raise the price or lower the price. Again, this is a tool of politics. That is, the sellers of something or another might demand from the king, oh, we can't make a living, we need higher prices, please, your majesty, raise the price for us. And kings can do that, right? They can do that by law. All right, so Smith and Ricardo are saying, look, don't do any of that stuff, right? And this is very, very revolutionary at the time because they're suggesting that kings do less, right? That could very easily be interpreted as take away some of our power, right? Instead, give that to the market, right? Let markets do as they will, okay? This becomes, is known at the time as the laissez-faire. All right, laissez-faire is the French phrase meaning let it be, do as you will. Okay, so it's like leave markets alone. Don't do any of the stuff that I mentioned above. Okay, don't do the barriers. Don't do any charters. Don't do any price controls. Stop that. Okay, that's laissez-faire. All right. And the idea here is that markets regulate themselves. They don't require outside regulation. Okay, they are self-regulating. If left to their own devices, they produce prices which, okay, they produce. So here's the argument. Okay, competitive markets. All right, comp stands for competitive. Competitive markets produce prices that have very desirable characteristics for society. Okay, these prices lead to, the prices are fair, the prices are stable, and they also lead to, they are efficient. That is in the sense of leading to the maximum output or wealth. Okay, so if we tamper with the prices, if we do price controls, if we create monopolies, or if we have barriers, we are going to be interfering with the price mechanism. Okay, that's the argument that comes out of the tradition of Smith and Ricardo. Okay, now this, Smith and Ricardo are dead by the middle of the 19th century, right? Ricardo dies actually rather young. So, it's not them that is arguing this later. It's those who follow in that tradition, right? This is what a school of thought is in economics. It becomes a set of themes, right? And the major theme of this one, right, classical political economy, the major theme is markets were great on their own. They are self-regulating. That's the laissez-faire position. Leave them alone, right? As long as we have competition, we don't really need anything else, and we can have a very minimal role for government. Okay, the government should largely get out of the way here. All right, that's what that laissez-faire means. And this later, these same ideas get called other things. Okay, so sometimes at the time, laissez-faire was called liberalism. Okay, liberalism, because liberal, it's like liberty, right? Free markets, free trade, that's liberalism. Okay, so nowadays we would call it classical liberalism. Okay, or sometimes we call it neoliberalism. Right, when ideas are around for a while, that they get called different things. Neo means new. All right, so neoliberalism, laissez-faire, classical liberalism, all of this is saying exactly the same thing, which is we can trust markets and we should leave them alone. Okay, so in terms of economic theory, right, when we turn to economics, right, like I said, this is a school of thought in economics, and it's one of our kind of early schools of thought, or perhaps the oldest one. Okay, and this is a school of thought that develops and changes over time, right? Like I said, these ideas are initially, they're called classical political economy. Okay, in the 19th century, they become renamed and are then known as neoclassical economics. All right, and then they are renamed again in the 20th century and become known as microeconomics. Okay. Now, I know this is confusing. I don't love that there are so many different names for the same basic set of ideas, but there are changes. There is a development that takes place, right, in this 200 years or so, 240 years of history that has passed during this time. Okay, so Smith and Ricardo becomes, that's where this begins. But the transition to neoclassical economics, which begins at around the time about the 1860s, okay, and then transitioning to microeconomics at about the 1940s, okay. So what changes during this time, right? What changes in the 1860s is other theorists take the ideas of Smith and Ricardo and begin to use mathematical proofs, right? So you don't find this in Smith. If you can read Smith from cover to cover. Smith does not use a single equation in it, right? Same for Ricardo. They do not use mathematical proofs. They don't use mathematical functions. They make their arguments in a much more traditional fashion. Okay, they write words and sentences, right? And there's still a logic in there, right? The statements that they've established, then they use that to build the next step in their argument. So it's still very much a logical thing, but it's not using the language of mathematics or the language of proofs. That changes in the 1860s. And there's also a new theory that is added, which is called utility theory. Okay, which we get quite into this in the micro course, right? So then that is developed and changed. The name goes through a change and becomes known as microeconomics. Okay, so this is one of our three schools of thought in economic theory. Okay, so I tend to just call it microeconomics or neoclassical economics because that's a more modern name for it. All right. Smith and Ricardo are focusing very much on the positive aspects. Okay, so Smith and Ricardo are focusing very much on the positive aspects of capitalism, but that's not all there is to it, right? This new system has a lot of negative aspects to it, right? Like I mentioned a few of them, right? There's this whole displacement of thousands, even millions of people who are their traditional way of life has been disrupted, right? So the traditional occupations get disrupted. There's this movement that goes from the countryside to the cities, okay? And this is such a huge movement. And by the way, this occurs not just in England at the time, but this happens everywhere that there's industrialization, right? The percentage of the population that's in the countryside declines, and the percentage of the population that's in the cities rises, okay? Now, it's not always the case that the absolute number goes down, right? Because at the same time, we have a lot of population growth, okay? So, but relatively, okay, that's why I say I put percentage, okay? The percentage of the population that's in the countryside, that's farming, that's doing agriculture, is in the old system before industrialization, very, very high, right? That's the vast majority. It's something like 90% live in the countryside, perhaps 10% live in the cities. That goes through a reversal, right? We go towards the modern industrial economy is almost everybody lives in the cities. The overwhelming majority live in the cities. Relatively few live in the countryside, okay? That's very different, right? There's all kinds of problems and tensions and contradictions that result from this massive migration from the countryside to cities, okay? So one aspect I've already hinted at, I've already mentioned, okay? One aspect is unemployment. Now, unemployment results from, okay, we have something which is disrupting the traditional occupations. You can no longer make a living spinning yarn or making pins by hand or whatever, right? You need to seek a job. But, here's the problem, right? That people are pouring into the cities because there's new jobs, right? What if the number of new jobs in the city is less than the number of people who are entering the city, right? The number of new people who are entering that city. That could very easily happen, right? I mean, there's no law that says these two have to be equal, right? I mean, if they're equal, fine, you don't get a lot of unemployment. But because these are coming out of totally different forces, right? Like, how many new people are you going to hire? Well, it doesn't have to do with you. You're not bound to hire everybody who is there. You don't have to, right? You hire how many you need based on the needs of the market. Can you sell the output, etc., right? So in many cases, it's less than, right? There's nothing that says they have to be equal, right? So we get for the first time unemployment. Unemployment is very, very hard to understand, right? Because unemployment this is a new thing. It's not part of the old system, right? Feudalism, the serfs were bound to their lord, right? You could not get fired. You couldn't get fired, right? A serf doesn't get fired. You can be forced to work, yes. You can be dragged back to the feudal manor if you run away, yes, as long as it's within that year. But you can't be really unemployed, right? If you're a serf, That's one of the few benefits. You have a plot, you have your tenure, you have your plot of land, right? And the same with the carpenters and blacksmiths and whatever, right? The guild system makes sure that there are not too many blacksmiths, right? That there's enough demand for their services so that they can all make a living, right? Unemployment is very, very minor, if it really even exists at all. It's very, very slight in the society, so much so that it doesn't even really have a name. Until the modern era begins, then it all of a sudden becomes a huge problem, right? The cities have other strains on them, right? Unemployment obviously is heavily related to poverty, okay? So if you can no longer make a living and come to the new city, are not able to find a job, you're going to find yourself poor and without any recourse, right? So you can't. It's not like you can go back to farming in a city, right? You can't hunt and gather. You can't do any of the things that human beings have done traditionally to make a living. You are going to be desperately poor, okay? And this leads to a kind of a contradiction, right? Because the contradiction of the modern city is that great wealth, I mean, the cities are, Smith and Ricardo are right about this. They are generating absolutely huge amounts of wealth and output, but at the same time, they side by side with most extreme poverty and deprivation. Okay, so wealth and poverty exist side by side, right? And it's just a mind bender. It's very hard to understand. I mean, I think we still feel this today, right? Whenever you see a person, in a city anywhere really, who very clearly has nothing, um, it's like, why should this exist, right? We're producing a huge amount of wealth, and then there are people who are living, you know, um, very, very poor under very poor conditions. Okay, so uh, these are negatives, all right. Now we also have these new factories. If you're lucky enough to find a job in a new factory, but here's the thing about life in this new factory system is we have very long hours, right? Very, very long hours. At first there was no limit to the number of hours that people worked in a factory. Okay, so the very first limitation on the workday was to limit it to 12 hours. 12 hours, right? Wow. So before that, it was longer. It was 14 hours, right? So what's 14 hours look like? It looks like this, right? It looks like 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Holy crow, right? I don't know, man. Have you ever worked a job like that consistently? You ever worked a job like that 6 days a week? A job like that will tear you up, right? You can get used to anything, right? But that is going to shorten your life, right? Especially if it's a job in an old time textile factory. Okay, there's no safety equipment in these early factories, right? The early factories are extremely dangerous, right? Um, Everything is driven by steam power. Okay, that means it's driven by belts. Okay, the equipment is belt driven. And I don't know if you've ever been around a machine that has a belt that's spinning from one wheel to the other. It's very dangerous, right? Because, whenever you see that belt moving, you're like, oh, what if something gets caught in it, right? What if my sleeve gets caught in it? What if my hand gets caught in it, right? Well, in these early factories, losing a finger or a hand or even an arm is not uncommon at all, right? The workers are cleaning the equipment while it is in operation, right? So someone's job is to sweep out the textile fibers of the machines. Um, Now, obviously, I'm talking about a different level of development. Okay, so but by now, okay, we've capitalism has developed a little bit more. We've gotten into the 1860s. Okay, this is a different era. By the time we have large scale factories with machinery, we're no longer in the era of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was talking about the very birth of the system, small scale factories that are more like workshops. Now we're talking about these large scale textile factories. Okay, the textile fibers, the dust from the textile process, that is the portions of the fibers that break off and go into the air. This gives you, like a lung condition, right? It gives you brown lung your lungs take in these fibers, and then they don't over time they don't function as well anymore. You get so right. This is if you're lucky enough to find a job in the city, right? It's going to be a difficult experience. It's not going to be an easy job, right? Now you have other aspects of so these are some of the problems, right? The unemployment, the poverty. You have other aspects of life in the cities. You have disease, right? The rise of infectious disease because there's the cities are growing. They don't have initially they don't have good sanitation. All that stuff gets developed at around this time. But the okay, so you guys get the idea, right? The point is there's a lot of negatives involved here, right? And we can look at the society and see it is incredibly unequal, right? That is, there are some who are doing very well from this new system, right? The factory owners and the merchants, they are doing very well. But the workers are in an unbelievable kind of condition of deprivation and suffering, right? Um, so workers are poor, deprived, unemployed, etc. Right? So we need to try to understand this, right? A new theorist arises who says it's very important. We need to not just focus on the positives like Smith and Ricardo did, but to also focus on the negative aspects, the ways in which this new system is not working. Okay, and this is Marx who does this. All right, Karl Marx. So Karl Marx becomes famous for a book that he wrote with his close collaborator named Engels. They wrote in 1848. They wrote a pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto, or the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And this becomes one of the most widely read documents of all time. I mean, it is happening in 1848. There is a very broad-based revolution that are occurring in many, many different European countries. These are called the revolutions of 1848. And the Communist Manifesto gets involved with this, right, and says, what is going on here, right? Are these revolutions which are seeking to overturn the old feudal order, the lords and all the order of the lords and the serfs? We're trying to overturn that because why, right? People got sick of it. It's exploitative. It's unfair. The lords get rich, and the serfs work their whole lives and perish, right? So, and there's no voting and whatever, right? It is based on exploitation, based on inequality. Okay, so it's an extremely unequal situation. By 1848, a lot of writers and philosophers have argued things like all men are created equal, right? Does that sound familiar? It's from the Declaration of Independence, of course, right? The idea that everyone is equal is a very new and revolutionary development in society, okay? And Marx and Engels say, yes, absolutely, right? We don't want to overturn the exploitation and unfairness of the old system and then reproduce it, right? Because, look, okay, it's not fair that you have a lord that, makes you work part of the time for free on their land, but it also doesn't seem good that in this new system, the merchants and factory owners are like modern day lords, right? And the workers are like modern serfs. We don't want a new system of exploitation. We don't want a new version of the exploitation and unfairness that we're just rejecting. We want something that works for everyone, right? We want a society that is not just geared towards making the rich richer. We want a society that works for all of society, right? That is that works for all people, in which we do the best for everyone, right? We put the interests of society first, okay? We don't say oh, look, you don't have a job. Well, that sucks for you, right? You should have worked harder. No, we say we're not going to permit there to exist a situation where we produce enough food for everybody and yet people still starve. That is a failure of society. We cannot allow that. That's wrong, right? That's as wrong as allowing slavery, or as wrong as allowing serfdom. We need to create socialism, right? And that's what this is called at the time, okay? Socialism, or we need to create communism. What is this? A society that is completely and entirely based on sharing, cooperation, love, right? A society based on love. Wow. I mean, who else said that we should do something like this, right? Um, it was this guy who wrote a long time ago. You might have heard of him. I think his name was Jesus, right? Yeah, right. Jesus said, give your neighbor your coat, right? You should not you should not allow there to be poor people who suffer in society, right? If someone is hungry, give them food, right? That's Jesus, right? So if we're a Christian society, we should not allow people to starve when there's enough food. We should not allow people to be unemployed. We should not allow people to be living in conditions of deprivation, right? So this is the tradition of socialism and communism. Marx and Engels did not invent these ideas, right? These are very old ideas. They go back a long way, right? Like I mentioned, they are present in early Christianity. They're present throughout Christianity. Um, I mean, there's other messages present there as well. But okay, so the point is, Marx and Engels developed this, and Marx adds to this argument in 1867. He writes a book called Capital, a critique of political economy. Okay, and critique of political economy. Now, remember, Marx has the advantage in terms of economic theory because he comes much later. He's writing almost 100 years after Adam Smith. He has the opportunity to read Adam Smith, and he reads Adam Smith very carefully. He reads Ricardo very carefully, right? So he has the opportunity to read and think about these issues, to learn from these theorists, and then to produce something new, okay? So that's what the subtitle of this means, right? A critique of political economy. And what Marx and to some extent Engels, they become the great critics of this new system, okay, capitalism, right? Now here's the irony, the historical irony is that that term capitalism seems to have been invented by Marx, right? So that's odd, right? That's ironic that the term that we use to describe the system seems to have been invented by its greatest critic. All right, so let's try to understand Marx's argument a little bit, right? Marx says, okay, look, we have the factory system, okay? The factory, or, capitalism, is also based on exploitation, okay? It's based on exploitation just as feudalism was based on exploitation, slavery is based on exploitation, so is capitalism, okay? But capitalism has, its exploitation is much harder to understand. It's hidden. It's more invisible, okay? And the reason it's hidden is it's hidden by markets, okay? So here's the appearance that you have in markets, okay? So workers receive wages, right? And in exchange for that, they produce products, right? They produce things. And the idea that, is popular when Marx is writing is that this is a very fair system, right? The workers work and they receive wages, okay? So every hour they are producing, right? Every the hours of their time, that's what they sell. And in exchange, they receive wage. There's no hours where they're not being paid. Well, okay, so at the time, workers were paid by the day, but nowadays we're paid by the hour, right? So you guys get the idea, right? The point is, you're paid for every unit of your time, okay? Unlike feudalism, there's no unpaid days. Doesn't exist, right? And so the argument is that is fair, right? You're selling your time and receiving the equivalent value of your time, right? That is fair, okay? And so capitalism involves no exploitation, okay, according to those who are in favor of it, those who are supportive of it, okay? Marx says this is a bunch of hooey. That's not true, all right? You couldn't get further away from the truth, okay? In order to understand it, see, the exploitation is hidden, okay? In order to understand why this is wrong, we need to get into a little more detail of it, okay? So we need to analyze a factory in more detail, okay? So this is what Marx does. He says, let's imagine that a factory is producing chairs, okay? A factory is producing chairs, and let's say that a one worker working during the day is able to produce a chair, one chair, and that chair gets sold, and it has a value of $200. Okay, so let's just assume, like Marx, in making his argument, he says, of course you'd like to be able to sell something for more than $200. You'd love to be able to sell it for $250. But let's just say that it's competitive and whatever. You're not able to sell it for more than what it's worth. This is truly what it's worth, okay? And that's the assumption that we'll make just to make things clear, okay? Of course, if you could sell it for more, you will, but let's assume you can't, okay? So here's the thing: we need to take this value and understand it, right? We need to split it into its constituent parts, okay? So let's say that this $200 in value is represented by this block right here, okay? So this is the value of one chair, okay, the total value. And Marx says, look, we can split it into different parts, okay? So part of this is going to be the value that has been embodied in it, okay? So Marx calls this embodied labor, all right? Embodied labor means the value of the tools, the equipment, the raw materials, etc. Right? The wood and the nails and the fabric and the all that stuff, right? That goes into producing the chair. Okay, so let's just say that this embodied labor is like $60. Okay. Now, Marx goes into a very detailed description of this, right? He says, this isn't all just raw materials, right? And tools and equipment, we have to treat in a particular way, right? Because if you use a screwdriver to screw in a screw, well, that screwdriver has not been consumed, right? A screwdriver lasts a long time. So what exactly do you do with that, right? You depreciate it, okay? So this is very much the same as what modern accounting does. We say, okay, if a tool lasts 10 years, then during the course of 1 year, 10% of it, 1/10, right, has been consumed in the production process. Okay, so that 1/10 of the value of that tool has been added to the value of the material that, the wood and the screws and whatever, right? So Marx says, this is embodied labor, okay? Why is it called that? Because somebody else in the past produced that tool. Somebody else produced the equipment. They produced the raw materials. The value has been embodied in those products, which then give their value to the chair, okay? So remember, the total value of the chair is $200, but this portion of it, okay, if you use up, $40 of raw materials and then, $20 of depreciation of your tools and equipment, then this portion has added $60 in value, okay? Now there's another portion of the value, which is going to be the workers' wages, okay? And Marx, all right, so the workers' wages, and let's say that the workers get paid $70 for that day, okay? So now here's the thing, okay? Workers get paid according to what the market will bear, all right? So that is, the worker is paid for their time, right? But the value of their time, $70, is very different from the value that they produce, right? Because look at this, right? The tools, equipment, raw materials, the wages of the workers. You see what this adds up to? This part of it, these two blocks, add up to $130. But that's not what the chair is worth, right? The chair is worth $200. What's the difference? Where does that come from, right? Well, the difference is profit, right? So this is called gross profit. Marx uses the term surplus value to describe this, okay? Surplus value, or in German it's Mehrwert, right? More value. So the workers don't just produce $70 in value to cover their own wages. They produce an additional $70 in value, and this part of it goes to not the worker who produced this value, but it goes to the capitalist, right? It goes to the one who owns the factory, okay? So it looks like, oh, it's all fair, right? The worker gets paid for every hour of their time. But Marx says that's an illusion, okay? Because here's the deal, right? The worker has produced how much value, right? They've produced 70 plus 70, okay? They have produced 70 plus 70, $140 in value, okay? The modern language, we would call this value added, all right? The worker has added $140 of value, but is only paid $70, right? How different is this from the old system, really, right? I mean, yeah, it's different, right? Because, you can quit this job, you don't like it, okay, I quit. You can be fired as well, right? You don't have to swear any kind of oath of loyalty to your employer. There's lots of things that are different, right? But economically, it's very similar to what's happening in the past, right? Marx is saying, look, the worker is only really paid for half the day, right? It takes the worker all day to produce this value, right? $140 worth of value. They're only paid $70 of it. It looks like they got paid for the whole day, but really they only got paid for half the day, right? Getting paid for half your time, right? It's a lot like feudalism, says Marx. It's a lot like that very thing that we're trying to reject, okay? Right now, that we're marching in the streets, that we're risking our lives to overturn. What are we going to do? Replace it with this new thing? I mean, it's almost like if someone is beating you, with a bat, and you say, "No, damn it, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. Stop beating me. I will not endure this one more second." And then someone else steps up and says, "Yeah, you're wrong. Okay, I'm going to beat you with this cane." Now, you're not going to say, "Oh, yeah, that's cool," right? "Yeah, that's fine. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that." No, it's still beating. How about no beating whatsoever, right? Don't beat me with a different implement, Don't give me exploitation by a different name, a fancier kind of exploitation. We want a society that works for everyone, right? That's not based on enriching a few, right? Because look at what happens, right? The capitalist who did nothing for this, right? Their labor did not produce any of this, right? They're the ones that end up becoming rich, right? And this is true, right? The society becomes unequal in much the same way, right, as the feudal order was unequal, okay? Because the rich live by different rules. Yeah, the law is nominally the same for everybody, right? But come on, right? Is that really true? Spend some time in a court and you'll see the law is not the same, right? It may be on the books the same for everybody, but the results are very different according to our society is unequal. Now, yes, it's unequal in new ways, right? It's not based on your birth exactly, right? It's based on how much property you own. Now, Marx creates a second argument. Okay, his first argument is that capitalism is unfair, that it's based on exploitation. Okay, and he of course has a solution to this, right? His solution is we need a revolution in society. We need to overturn exploitation, right? We need to overturn all forms of exploitation, right? We need to end capitalism in order to create a society that truly works for everyone, we can't have a few people owning a lot of society's wealth. We just can't have that, right? They're going to get richer and richer over time, and they're going to spend their money in ways which defend their position, right? We can't have that, right? So we need to, this was their phrase, right? We need to abolish private property in what they call the means of production. Okay, so abolish private property doesn't mean you can't own anything. It just means you can't own this kind of stuff, okay? You can't own factories, farms, etc., stuff like this, right? Stuff which will produce wealth on a large scale. That needs to belong to all of society, because it really does belong to all of society, right? By making it privately owned, we make it so that it's going to enrich a small number of people, right? That is not going to work for all of society, right? We're going to have all of the problems of capitalism, the poverty, the exploitation, the inequality, all of that is going to continue to exist, and it might even get worse, right? Argues Marx. Okay, so his secondary point is that capitalism has contradictions within it, okay? Marx was very fascinated by the logic of contradiction. You know, he was a student of Hegel, right, the German philosopher, who focused on dialectics, contradiction, okay, there's the logic of contradiction. And Marx argued the contradictions of capitalism will lead it to potentially have a crisis, okay? And Marx studied the different crises that capitalism had gotten into, right? These days we might call this something like a recession. But at the time that Marx was writing in 1867, the recessions that he was able to observe had been much more local, right? We hadn't had a truly global recession. But, you know, this is what Marx kind of envisioned. Unfortunately, he did not get to finish this aspect of his writing, okay? He wrote the book, The Capital, but he planned on Capital to being 6 volumes. And he was only able to finish one of them, right? He died relatively young, okay? So but he made this argument in a kind of unfinished form, and this ended up becoming the 3rd volume. The volumes 2 and 3 of Capital were edited by Engels and published after Marx died. Okay, so the contradictions of capitalism will lead to a global crisis. That is, you know, again, an unfinished part of Marx's work, but it became very much what he was known for, right? These 2 points, okay? Capitalism exploitative, and it has its contradictions, which will lead to a crisis at some point, right? So this is an opportunity for those of us who want to point out, okay, that the system is based on exploitation. At a time when it breaks down, that's a good time to really make that argument and to say, maybe it's time to think about a system that truly works for everybody, not just for the rich, right? We can do that when it's in crisis, okay? So Marx wanted to understand, right, what are these contradictions of capitalism, okay? So that's the argument from Marx. All right, we get into the 1930s, and it seems like that global crisis of capitalism has really arrived. Okay, so the global crisis, which later ends up being called the Great Depression, it takes place around the industrialized world, right? So, all industrialized countries experience a recession, a depression at the same time, okay? The one country that doesn't, though, okay, except this country gets called the Soviet Union, okay? So the Soviet Union is Russia, right? Russia had overturned their king, which is called the Tsar, right? It's a shortening of the word Caesar. This is what they call the king in Russia, the Tsar of Russia. So they overturned the Tsar, and they ended up forming a socialist government. Okay, the first one in the world, right, at the time. Okay, this is in 1917. Okay, this is the revolution begins early in this year. Pretty much the entire year is occupied by revolution because the czar had become so unpopular, right? So they overturned the czar and they set up a socialist government, right? They abolish. They do pretty much what Marx and Engels called for in the Communist Manifesto. They abolish private property. Okay, the in factories and things, right? The government, the state owns all of that stuff, right? And the state uses that to rapidly industrialize the society, okay? Because uh, Russia at the time was the poorest and most backward country in Europe. Absolutely, right? No competition, right? The Russia's a large country and was even an empire at the time. They had extended their boundaries and so forth under the Tsar. Uh, but they weren't very industrialized, right? And the entire society, especially in rural areas, was pretty unproductive, okay? That is, the productivity of labor was very low, okay? And they say, we need to change this right away, okay? The Great War, that is World War I, which had just ended at this time, has shown us that the industrial powers, they are much more powerful. They could conquer us, even though it's a much smaller country, right? Germany is a much smaller country than Russia, but Germany almost conquers Russia, right? They do conquer a portion of it, in fact. Um, you force Russia into a treaty. This is partly what makes the Tsar so unpopular. So, the Russians, the socialists, right, the Bolsheviks, they're called, they say we need rapid industrialization, but we also need this industrialization to be to the benefit of all in the society. Okay, so we're not going to have the kind of rapid industrialization that occurred in England with all of that poverty and unemployment and deprivation. No, that's not acceptable, right? We need to make sure that everyone has a job. Everyone has a pension even, right? Everyone can retire, right? We need to make sure that everyone has health care. So they do a lot of things to maintain, even though they're industrializing, and industrializing is a hard and wrenching process for every society that's ever gone through it, right? And in Russia, that's also the case, right? It's a very, very wrenching process. It involves a tremendous amount of suffering, right? Because they compress what happens in England and France and Germany, happens over hundreds of years. The Soviets do it in a few decades, okay? So it's just unbelievable, right? And that leads to a lot of social tensions and problems and contradictions. But the benefit is that they're able to achieve very rapid economic growth. I mean, some of the most rapid economic growth that the world has ever seen, right? And they're able to achieve a very remarkable combination, which is rapid economic growth and all of these, the macro statistics that we look for, things like, how is the health of the society affected by this, right? People are living longer. There's a population explosion, right? It is rapid economic growth where the wealth is broadly shared. Now, I know this is different from what we are often taught about the Soviet Union, right? We are often not taught anything about this, right? We're just taught, oh, this didn't work and it was a failure. Um, that is American propaganda, right? So to say that it didn't work is, I don't know, that's just a misreading of the historical record. I mean, this produced unbelievably rapid economic growth that, like I said, was very broadly shared. Okay, so anyone who looks into this in a little, even a cursory way, will see that. Okay, so the problem that the Soviet Union presented then in the 1930s, the rest of the industrialized world is in a global depression. The Soviet Union has other problems in the 1930s, right? But the Great Depression is actually not one of them. Um, they have a problem, which is there's a lot of conflict in the society. They had a civil war that cost millions of lives. Um, they have a lot of different foreign agents that are trying to destabilize the society. They are trying to industrialize agriculture, right? They have a lot of different problems, but they do not have a Great Depression. Okay, and this represents a kind of existential threat to capitalism, right? So a new theorist arises, right? So we end up with a new economic theory. Because here's the problem, right? The problem is the kind of economic theory that we had in the past, right? Neoclassical economics, does not offer a good explanation or even tell us what to do, right? It just says, well, government should stay out of the market and then we'll be fine, right? That doesn't seem to be happening, right? The government can stay out of it. The market does not seem to be self-regulating. It does not seem to be fixing itself. Um, the only theory that really explains how and why this would happen is Marxism, right? Marxism says, hey, capitalism has contradictions, and those contradictions will lead to a crisis. Um, so this is the theory of Marx and Engels, is of course called Marxism. Um, so those who stand to benefit from capitalism, right? The factory owners and the merchants and so forth, right? Um, the Marx uses this old French term to refer to those who benefit from, defend capitalism. They are called the bourgeoisie. So fancy French term, okay? The bourgeoisie, right? They need some way of explaining why the Great Depression occurred and what to do about it. That isn't Marxism, right? That isn't anti-capitalist. They need a pro-capitalist kind of economics, but that explains recessions, okay? This new economic theory is created in the 1930s by a guy named John Maynard Keynes, right? Often went by just his middle name. His father's name was also John, so he went by Maynard. John Maynard Keynes, right? Keynes comes from a very rich family, right? He is technically a lord, okay? He's writing in England, right? The birthplace of capitalism has also produced a lot of economics, a lot of economic theory, right? So Keynes is very clear. He is defending the interests of his class, right? He's a professor, okay? So he teaches at the most prestigious college, King's College in Cambridge. He has some of the most prominent neoclassical thinkers had been his teachers and professors, right? So he's very much trained, in the classical and neoclassical economics, but he produces something new, right? He produces a new understanding of economic theory, right? And this is what he does, right? He says, look, markets are not self-regulating. Right, we'll go into his argument, later on in the course. In the macro course, we get into a lot of detail in this, right? So markets are not self-regulating, okay? In fact, the price mechanism does not work well enough, okay? Markets fail to adjust to decreases in the overall price level. All right, they fail to adjust it to decreases in the overall price level. They are downward sticky, okay, according to Keynes. They get stuck, all right? And because they get stuck, we end up with a failure to adjust, okay? This is a market failure, all right? The result of this is we have low aggregate demand, all right? Low aggregate demand is the cause of the Great Depression, according to Keynes. Okay, so low aggregate demand is another way of saying the total spending in the economy is just simply too low. All right? Now, if markets were going to correct themselves, what they would do is prices would fall and then people would buy more. Okay, the details of this we're going to get into later on. All right, so markets could self-correct themselves, perhaps, right? According to economic theory, markets can self-correct, but Keynes says that doesn't work for a variety of reasons. Okay, we have labor unions, right? And workers, through the action of labor unions, they're able to refuse lower wages, right? They do not accept lower wages. They will not work for lower wages. You cannot adjust. All prices are supposed to fall, right, including wages. If there's less demand, prices should fall. That's self-regulating markets. Keynes looks at this and says it doesn't happen, all right? The price mechanism fails to adjust downward. It's downward sticky. Uh, and so workers, they what we end up with is unemployment, right? And that unemployment can be very severe, okay? So to solve this, okay, what is the solution? Is it a socialist revolution? No, right? No, not at all, right? Keynes is trying to defend the system of capitalism, not overturn it, right? Now, he has read Marx. He doesn't talk a lot about Marx. He disagrees with it, right? He does not want to. He wants to maintain the hierarchical system, right? He wants to maintain capitalism. He does not want to lose his position. He does not want everyone to be equal. None of that, right? That's not Keynes. Okay, Keynes. So we need to solve this in a different way. Okay, so we need to raise our aggregate demand. All right, we need to raise aggregate demand, and the only way we can raise aggregate demand, or the easiest way, according to Keynes, is through government action. All right, so the government can simply spend more money, right? This is called fiscal policy. Or the government can work through the banking system to change interest rates and stimulate investment. The process is obviously a lot more detailed than what I'm saying, but it is in general called monetary policy. Okay, so Keynes lays out, right, he rejects the central idea of neoclassical economics, which is that markets are self-regulating. He says, they're not self-regulating. They need outside regulation. They need government regulation. And that action needs to be well-timed, right? So governments need data, and they need to be smart. They need to be educated, right? They need to do the right thing at the right time, right? Like, should the government always spend more money? No, no, no. They should only spend more money when aggregate demand is too low, right? That means that the government needs the data to be able to monitor the economy much more closely than ever before. Okay, so by the time of the 1930s and into the 1940s, governments begin to collect that data, right? They are very influenced by Keynes, right? And so Keynes produces a new kind of economics, and it's called Keynesian economics initially, because it's so much based on one person, right? It's so much based on the writings of Keynes. Okay, so just a little pronunciation note here. Keynes, even though it looks like it starts with key, like Keynes, Keynesian, that's not how it's pronounced. Okay, it's pronounced Keynes like this. Okay, so you'd pronounce this Keynesian, all right, like that. All right, so Keynesian economics, again, rejects some of the central ideas of neoclassical economics. It says, look, yeah, productivity and all that stuff is great. Okay, I like what you're saying about that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the economy will always be at a maximum level of output. The level of output can change, right, depending on changes in aggregate demand. Okay, so the main risk to capitalism, according to Keynesian economics, is that aggregate demand, AD, is often too low. All right, and so the government must, through its policies, right, they must manage aggregate demand. Okay, markets, in other words, are not self-regulating. We cannot afford to just do laissez-faire. We can't just leave them alone and assume that everything will be great. No, government needs to be smarter than that. They need to be wise. We need to elect leaders who are wise and beneficent, right? They do the right thing for capitalism as a whole, okay? So we must save capitalism from itself. Okay, that was the thinking of the Keynesians, right? And Keynesian economics later got renamed and became known as macroeconomics. Okay, again, not long after Keynes. Keynes dies in the mid 1940s, and so for that period, it's Keynesian, or it's people would just refer to Keynes or cite Keynes. But not long after that, it started to become known as microeconomics and macroeconomics. Okay, so Keynes, of course, what he does is criticize microeconomics, right? He criticizes the classical political economy and says basically markets are not self-regulating, right? So, okay, we have two forms of pro-capitalist economics, right? The micro, right, neoclassical, obviously highly pro-capitalist, okay, but is in favor of free markets, okay? The macroeconomics, okay, Keynesian economics, is also, guess what, pro-capitalist, okay? But it believes in regulated markets, okay? Regulated markets. Now, Marxism is kind of like the black sheep of economics. While there's always a course in micro, there's always a course in macro, right? There's always the two kinds of pro-capitalist economics. Those are always represented, right? In every college, every university, right? But there's very rarely is there a course in Marxism, right? Marxism is the excluded. Marxism is the other. It's the one that the rest of the field wishes doesn't exist, right? Because Marxism is deeply, deeply anti-capitalist, right? If you don't understand that about Marxism, you understand basically nothing about it, right? I mean, it's anti-capitalist to its core, right? So it rejects that there should be a capitalism, right? It says capitalism is by nature exploitative. It's full of contradictions. The what we should be doing is getting rid of it, right? We shouldn't have. It's not a question of fair markets, free markets or fair regulated markets. Not a question of that at all, right? I mean, like what if you were having an argument with somebody about slavery and somebody said, well, if we just regulate it well enough, then it'll be fine. And you'd be like, what? No, it's not fine. Are you kidding me? It's still slavery. You don't regulate it? What are you going to make sure that every slave gets 2 shirts a year or something like that? No. This is an unfair, unacceptable system. There's no regulating it. You can't tune it up and make it work better. It is an abomination that should not exist, right? That is how the Marxists feel about capitalism, right? So they're not taking a position about is it better to have free markets or regulated markets. Their position is no, we need to abolish capitalism and to create socialism, which is a bridge to then the ultimate vision of a communism that is truly based on sharing and cooperation, on love for all, right? So these are the three different influential, I mean, this is not all the schools of thought that exist in economics, but these are 3 highly influential ones, right? Micro and macro, like I said, in every single college. And Marxism is the great other, the great critic of capitalism, the anti-capitalist kind of economics, all right? So that's my lecture for today. Thank you very much.